Support for this episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlockian scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. And also by the generous support of listeners like you who choose to support us at Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Patreon.com/trifles.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the Greek interpreter interpreted, the Norwood builder built, and the Reigate squires puzzled, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
How many disguises did Sherlock Holmes use? What were the street Arabs? And how did he get information from his underground network?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 321, Real-Life Inspirations, A Scandal in Bohemia. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast, where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, is this real life or is this just fantasy?
Well, you know, that's a very good question. We could be in a gigantic computer simulation. That's got to be true, or string theory has got to be true, or, I don't know, something's got to be true. This must be real life.
I think string theory is just stringing us along.
I think you're exactly right. But what am I going to do with this ball of yarn that I've saved over the years?
Make some yo-yos.
Oh, good idea. Hostess yo-yos. Perfect for breakfast.
Or just half a yo-yo, which would be a yo. This is episode 321. As we said, you can find the show notes for this episode at ihose.co/trifles321. We will be at the very end of this episode. Do we have one more left in this month? Because we want to be mindful.
Yes.
Yeah. This is our final episode of the month, so we will be holding a drawing at the end of the show. Stay tuned for that. All of our Patreon supporters are eligible to participate in this drawing. So if you support us from as little as $1 a month to $5 or $10 a month, whatever tier you have chosen, you are eligible for this drawing. The winner will receive a back copy of the Baker Street Journal. So make sure you are all Patreoned up in supporting us. The link is in the show notes, or you can simply go to patreon.com/trifles. And all of our patrons are eligible to listen to the show without ads. So if you don't want the interruption in the middle of the show, the disruption of our cadence, then feel free to join us over on Patreon. Well, we have, as it were, another topic here. This is interesting because this is something that was suggested by Rob Nunn, one of our listeners, and we've actually spoken with Rob most recently over on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Rob suggested in a thread on the Stranger's Room that a discussion topic might be interesting for us to pursue, looking at real-life people who inspired characters in the canon. And rather than do a cross-canonical analysis, because there are so many people here, and I know one of the sources that we've talked about for coming up with this is Don Redman's book, A Study in Sources. We thought we would go one story at a time. Not that there are real people or real inspired people from all 60 stories, but there are choice stories that we can run through and come up with some names. So, Bert, you've done the homework here. So I'm going to turn it over to you as you take us through this first story.
Hopefully, our listeners will agree with us that it's a great way to pursue digging into the Sherlock Holmes stories, because what's happened in the 60 cases of Sherlock Holmes is that a whole world has been created. And Arthur Conan Doyle, whose name we occasionally mention in these shows, drew upon the events of the day, his own personal experience, as any author would, to define some characters and to portray some events, and found inspiration in just daily life. And of course, tracking this down and putting it on paper is a little, requires a little care, because you can't really get too far here. I mean, this is, first of all, we know the cases of Sherlock Holmes are real, but also you'll never really know what was in the mind of a particular author. But the good news is we think we're on safe ground here, beginning particularly with a scandal in Bohemia. And so let's take a look at a couple of first of all, the major characters in Scandal in Bohemia, starting with Irene Adler. It's been pointed out that the first name Irene was perhaps suggested by an unsuccessful tragedy written by Samuel Johnson in 1737, Irene. And Irene is apparently also, no, I think it's the surname. I think Adler, obviously, is also the name of a river in Bohemia. So that's a very interesting potential connection.
And well, it always struck me that Adler was a kind of Dickensian name. That here is Irene Adler, or Irene Adler, if you want to go with the European pronunciation, has done the unthinkable. She has addled Sherlock Holmes. So she is, of course, an Adler. Not to be confused with an adder, which we will later encounter in The Speckled Band. It'll be interesting to see who the snake was inspired by.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if Grimsby Roylott called the snake Irene. Irene, Irene.
Good night, Irene. Yeah.
That's right. Good night, Helen. Yeah. But, the character of Irene Adler, more to the point, the very romantic character of an opera singer, a great personality, a great performer on the stage, someone whose artistry can galvanize an entire audience and portray the great characters, the great female characters in opera, and project so much emotion. That character could have been suggested by Lola Montez, who was the mistress of Ludwig I of Bavaria, or it could have been suggested, it's been noted, by Elizabeth Ann Howard, who was the mistress, apparently, of Napoleon III.
Wait, so you're saying the first one, her name was Lola? She was a showgirl?
No.
Oh, yeah. That's all we need is an Adlerian version of the Copacabana. Maybe we should rewrite that for fun sometime.
Oh, that would be fun. That's a great
We'll
idea.
put Karen Wilson on it. Karen Wilson, our friend from various Sherlockian science, does wonderful rewrites of songs with humorous lyrics for the canonically inclined.
Yes, and Alex Katz, too. Yeah.
Yes.
And then there's, we're in this area here of the great singers of the day. And these were people like Dame Nellie Melba, Adelina Patti.
Dame Nellie Melba, she was a peach. Sorry. We're not getting very far here. Sorry about that.
Yes, and Adelina Patti, no doubt was a burger, too. She was a burgermeister somewhere. Yeah. But
they were great singers. They were well-known singers. Were they dance hall singers? Were they opera singers? I would imagine a dame would be an opera singer.
Oh, Dame Nellie Melba. No, yeah, Adelina Patti, both great opera singers. Not in the music hall. And so it's interesting to think about this character of Irene Adler. Clearly had antecedents because the idea of a romantic, emotional, extremely talented woman on the stage projecting these characters, had some real roots in people like Dame Nellie Melba and Adelina Patti, and also in Lily Langtry, who was,
Mm.
had a long liaison with Queen Victoria's son, the future Edward VII.
Yeah, I mean, her name comes up quite frequently as the default inspiration for Irene Adler. And I think, removing this to Bohemia rather than keeping it in the UK was probably a wise move. So I think the point here, whether you're talking about Edward VII, whether you're talking about, well, actually it was the Prince of Wales then, whether you're talking about the King of Bohemia, Napoleon III, etc., is mistresses were not uncommon with senior members of the royal household.
Of many royal households, the Austrian Archduke Rudolph's love life had caused a scandal in Bohemia. We mentioned Lola Montez earlier. I believe Ludwig I sacrificed his rule for the affections of Lola
Oh,
Montez.
wow.
And so this, was a prominent theme.
Yeah. Yeah. So when it comes to the King of Bohemia, I think things are a little more cloudy. The king used the alias the Count von Kram, and he mentioned his fiancée Clotilde von Saxe-Meiningen, and Redmond, in A Study in Sources, says these are a genuine background deliberately disguised. And he couldn't find any mentions of them in their native land, but he said in London he finds one Charles Cram, a cutler, although Francis Kramer received medical degrees from Edinburgh in 1885, and strangely enough, Cram is a village in Peoria County, Illinois. No idea where Conan Doyle may have pulled that from. However, he did say that there was a family of von Krams in the 16th century, and around 1890 he can list about a half dozen or so von Krams who were part of the lineage there. So,
well, that's interesting, but it's good to stick closer to the environment around Conan Doyle. And one of the interesting things I came across in looking at this topic is the links to the title of Grand Duke of Kassel-Felstein. And this, of course, is one of the many titles that the King of Bohemia has in his portmanteau of titles, Grand Duke of Kassel-Felstein. And it's been pointed out that this may have been suggested, and I thought this was really interesting, by Karl Falstedt. So not Kassel-Felstein, but Karl Falstedt. Karl Falstedt apparently was the Swedish consul who was a fellow lodger with Conan Doyle at 23 Montague Place. And also, if you think about the history of Conan Doyle and his life, when he was young, he spent a time at school in Feldkirch, Austria, where he was at school in 1875. So you have Feldkirch, you have Falstedt, and here you have the Grand Duke of Kassel-Felstein. So it's a little bit of a reach, but I thought it was interesting.
well, that's interesting. I mean, but they all point in the same direction. So there's some concordance there that makes that particularly compelling. Well, why don't we take a quick pause here, and when we come back, we'll talk about other inspirations that we've managed to sniff out in A Scandal in Bohemia. Stay tuned. Well, Bert, I love the detective work that's going on here in this episode, and it reminds me of a lot of the detective work that we see with, well, great regularity in the Baker Street Journal. People have wonderful imaginations, or, have inspirations they come across in their own lives in one way or another, whether it's through a particular hobby, some outside reading that they did. And when they apply them to the Sherlock Holmes stories, it gives them the fuel to create some of these wonderful essays, suppositions, and data-backed theories that we see in the Baker Street Journal.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that's the fun of it, too, that someone who has a professional background in geology, such as Peter Blau, or a professional background in ophthalmology or in chemistry, can discover things and then turn their attention to how those professional areas, earth, rock formations, chemistry, ophthalmology, optics, have featured in the cases and characters of Sherlock Holmes. And there you've got, just great fodder for interesting papers.
Absolutely. And in this very episode, as we're talking about real-life inspirations, that brings to mind people that might have an interest in genealogy. There's all kinds of applications where you can take that interest and look at the stories and come up with something that's inventive and original. And people are still doing it today in the Baker Street Journal. Make sure you get your subscription to the BSJ so you're not missing out on any of these exciting directions by going to bakerstreetirregulars.com and subscribing today. Okay, we're back talking about real-life inspirations in A Scandal in Bohemia. It struck me, Bert, as we kick this series off, if indeed it does become a series, it reminds me of that disclaimer that we see at the end of many movies. All characters and events in this film or show, even those based on real people, are entirely fictional, et cetera, et cetera. It seems to be where the legal department gets its hold on some of the creative elements. But here's a bit of trivia question. Do you know where the origins of that disclaimer came from?
Oh, I imagine from some libel suit, but I have no idea about the specifics.
Well, I'm going to fill you in, and we will have a link to this. It's a story from Slate.com in 2016. We can thank none other than Rasputin for it. It all started when an exiled Russian prince sued MGM in 1933 over a biopic about Rasputin, claiming that MGM's production did not accurately depict how Rasputin was murdered. And this exiled prince should know because he admitted murdering him. So this was Prince Felix Yusupov. He was one of several Russian aristocrats who were agonizing over the influence of Rasputin. And Yusupov invited Rasputin to his palace, where he offered him cyanide-laced cakes and then shot him. And the Tsar let... Yeah, the Tsarina was distraught, but the Tsar let Yusupov off lightly, just exiling him with his wife. His wife's name, interestingly, was Irene. And in doing so, he actually saved this prince from being slaughtered in the Russian Revolution, which was to follow a few years later. But he was penniless in Paris, and he heard about the film, and he thought it was defamatory. And he argued that audiences would recognize him as the fictional assassin in the film, partly because he publicly cashed in on his infamy, writing a memoir about it. So he was clearly not being secretive of having contributed to the death of Rasputin. And he sued MGM regarding their production. And I think he was awarded about $125,000.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And what proved to be, according to this this article, what proved to be MGM's undoing was its lack of deniability. Unwisely, they prefaced the film with, This concerns the destruction of an empire. A few of the characters are still alive. The rest met death by violence. And from that, the audiences were led to believe that the Yusupovs, being the only relevant characters still alive, were actually represented as the characters in this film.
Okay, well, there you are. Well, I think we should point out that everything we say here has got absolutely no connection to anyone living or dead, with the exception of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah, and it also has no credibility. We should be clear of that.
Well, we have a lot of support for that, so we don't have to worry about it. Yeah. Oh dear. Well, moving on. If you look at other inspirations in Scandal and Bohemia, there are a couple of references here that are interesting. This, of course, is the first case of Sherlock Holmes in the Strand magazine, and one of the things we have in the story is Watson recounting Holmes's other involvement. In this early case, we have mentions of wonderful cases that we'll never learn anything more about, but that give you a sense of how impressive Holmes's powers are. And one is his summons to Odessa in the case of the Trepoff murder. Odessa is a name, a location that comes up relatively frequently in the cases of Sherlock Holmes. It pops up in Scandal and Bohemia as Holmes mentions a particular event in Odessa. And this could be an allusion to the murder of a General Trepov, who was shot by a nihilist in 1878. And it also could have been prompted by a story that was published in book form in 1891, around the time that Scandal in Bohemia appeared. Oscar Wilde's short story, Lord Arthur Saville's Crime, when a bomb is sent to the military governor at Odessa, which is timed to explode in 10 days in the story, but it hasn't exploded after several months. So there are a couple of reasons why Odessa could have been prominent around the time of the writing of the case of Scandal in Bohemia.
I like that angle with Oscar Wilde, because let's not forget that it was Oscar Wilde and Conan Doyle who came together for dinner in advance of The Picture of Dorian Gray and The Sign of Four, that famous dinner at the was that at the Langham Hotel,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah,
Which,
absolutely.
incidentally, the Langham is exactly where the King of Bohemia was staying in A Scandal in Bohemia.
Interesting.
So all signs kind of point towards the Langham having been freshly planted in Conan Doyle's mind. That interaction with Wilde, he could have gone back and read some of Wilde's previous works. I like it.
Yeah. And we also have the singular tragedy of the Atkinson brothers at Trincomalee. This could refer to a member of Parliament. Apparently, in February 1891, a member of Parliament in Lincolnshire, H.J. Atkinson, asked the government to bring in a bill that would compel writers of editorials to sign their articles. So the name of Atkinson was being reported in newspapers.
I've
And
got
there's-
another one on the Atkinson side, too. According, again, to Don Redmond, we don't need to look much further than Yorkshire. At George Atkinson, who was one of the last of the brilliant professionals in Yorkshire cricket in the 1860s. It was, I guess, in the words of Wisden's Cricketer's Almanac for 1907. And he was later a coach at some private schools. So we know Conan Doyle was a cricket enthusiast, so that could have been another source of Atkinson as an influence.
Interesting. And there's a point in Scandal in Bohemia when Holmes is researching the notepaper with Watson as a way of identifying who their visitor is likely to be. And as Holmes is looking up the particular area of Germany and Europe, he mentions the death of Wallenstein. And this could be a reference to the Duke of Friedland, who led imperial troops during the 30 Years' War. It was a real historical event rather than contemporary, because it was in the 17th century. But the life and death of the Duke of Friedland. It was the subject of the Wallenstein trilogy by Schiller, and that could well have been something that was of interest and awareness to Arthur Conan Doyle.
Or he could have been listening to the Waldstein Sonata and simply noted it wrong. I don't know. Well, all of these are fascinating influences. There's no definitive conclusion there. There's no notes behind the creation of this story, and I don't think is the manuscript for this story extant?
Oh yes, sure. It's been
that's
reprinted by the BSI Press.
Yeah. So it's worth exploring that again. We'll have a link in the show notes to that particular book, the manuscript series entry for A Scandal in Bohemia. I think that was the one that was edited by Otto Penzler, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, I think so, yeah.
Blanking on the name right now, but that is a great source for
Bohemian Souls. I think
Bohemian Souls. Perfect. Yeah, that's a great source for doing a little more original research on this.
Yeah, I think it's out of print, though. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Well, you can always find copies on ABE Books, eBay, etc. Well, in the absence of that original research, let's bring you our own research as to who in this particular episode is a winner of the back issue of the Baker Street Journal. Again, if you are a supporter on Patreon of Trifles, you are automatically entered in this drawing every month. So we will turn to the big prize wheel and give it a spin. There we go. And it lands on number 49. 49, and that looks like it is... it's a guy who does not need any back issues of the BSJ. It's Glenn Maranker. Hey, Glenn. All right. Congratulations to Glenn. Well, Glenn, we'll send a back issue your way, or if you would like to designate someone to whom you think it should go, we will get it into that person's hands. Well, that and all of the rest of what we talked about, I suppose, could just be considered a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Peculiar, that is the very word.